Look at the satellite imagery from May 2026, and you will see the physical manifestation of a regime reaching its breaking point. Across the vast, jagged stretch of the Russian border with NATO, once defined by the bristling might of the Leningrad military district, there is a profound and unsettling silence. Dozens of military bases that were active just a year ago are now essentially abandoned. They are empty squares of dirt, empty hangars, and silent parade grounds where thousands of tanks and infantry fighting vehicles once idled. We are not talking about a tactical repositioning or a routine exercise rotation. We are witnessing the total evacuation of Russia's primary deterrent force. Of the 30,000 hardened ground troops that once stood guard against the West, barely 6,000 remain. The rest, along with their armor, their heavy artillery, and their air defenses, have been sucked into the maw of the Ukrainian front. This is the most critical turning point in the war since the initial invasion of February 2022. For years, the Kremlin sold its domestic audience a narrative of existential dread, claiming that NATO was massing at the gates, ready to seize Russian territory. Putin used this supposed threat as the primary justification for his war, pouring billions of dollars into military expansion to protect these frontiers. He ordered the formal reconstruction of the Leningrad military district in late 2023, boasting to the world that he would field over 100,000 soldiers to counter the new membership of Finland and Sweden. Yet, the data tells a story of desperate, unchecked hemorrhaging. Moscow is currently burning through roughly $300 million a day to sustain its war machine in Ukraine, and it has exhausted the traditional ways to pay for the manpower needed to fill its ranks. The sheer scale of this deployment is difficult to comprehend. We are looking at a force depletion that effectively strips the entire northern border of its conventional defensive capability. The elite units, once tasked with guarding thousands of miles of border, have been decimated in combat, suffering staggering casualty rates that exceed 40% in some key sectors. Russia has moved so many pieces from the board that they have effectively reached the endgame, in a move that would have been unthinkable at the start of this conflict. The governor of Karelia has been forced to beg civilians to form volunteer militias to patrol a border that is nearly 800 miles long. A nation that claims to be a global nuclear superpower is now relying on local farmers and workers to watch for incursions on the most sensitive front in Europe. The irony is as sharp as it is dangerous. If the Kremlin truly believed that NATO was an aggressive alliance poised to strike, they would never have emptied their bunkers. They would never have stripped the S-400 batteries from Kaliningrad or pulled the 11th Army Corps from the Baltic coast. This is not a strategic defense. It is an act of total desperation. The NATO threat was always the pretext, never the cause. But by revealing this truth, Putin has exposed his flank to an opponent that is now watching every move with cold, clinical precision. With the border guard gone and the front line crumbling under the weight of its own internal contradictions, how does Russia expect to hold the line against a tactical opening that Ukraine is already beginning to exploit? The answer is simply that they cannot hold it. This is not a defensive strategy based on military doctrine. It is a gambling maneuver based on the desperate hope that NATO remains paralyzed by its own internal bureaucracy. The geography of the Russian northwestern border, particularly in the Karelia region, is a tactical nightmare for anyone trying to defend it with light infantry or, as we are seeing now, volunteer civilian militias. This landscape is dominated by dense taiga forests, sprawling marshes, and thousands of lakes that restrict movement to narrow corridors and aging rail lines. When the professional army was in place, they utilized these bottlenecks to funnel any potential threat into pre-sighted kill zones. Now, with the heavy armor units stripped away and moved to the Ukrainian meat grinder, that defensive depth has evaporated. The terrain here acts as a double-edged sword. In the summer months, the ground is soft, often boggy, and difficult for heavy vehicles to traverse off-road, which theoretically aids a defender. However, without the eyes of professional reconnaissance units and the reach of long-range artillery batteries, that same terrain becomes a blind spot. A maneuvering force, whether it be a NATO reconnaissance element or a long-range Ukrainian drone strike team, can move through these thousands of square miles of forest with virtual impunity. Russian commanders are now forced to monitor a border that stretches over 800 miles, a distance that would challenge even a fully mobilized modern army, let alone a hodgepodge of regional volunteers who have barely enough training to operate basic communications equipment, let alone direct a combined arms response. If we look further south toward the Suwalki corridor, the situation shifts from difficult to catastrophic. This 60-mile-wide strip of land is the only ground link between Belarus and the Russian exclave of Kaliningrad. Before the current crisis, this was considered the most dangerous flashpoint in Europe, the potential fuse for a Third World War. Now, it is essentially a bypassed geographic feature. Because the Russian forces that were once poised to pinch this corridor have been redeployed to the trenches in Ukraine, the strategic threat to NATO has been neutered. The terrain in this area is relatively flat, consisting of open farmland and small villages, which in the past would have allowed for rapid armored movement. Today, the emptiness of the Russian side of the border is palpable. The local infrastructure, which was built to support tens of thousands of troops, now stands silent. The rail lines that once carried heavy equipment brigades toward the Polish and Lithuanian borders sit idle, waiting for reinforcements that are never coming. The tactical reality is that distance has become the ultimate enemy of the Russian General Staff. Every time a new crisis erupts in the Donbass or around the Kursk region, the Kremlin must decide which part of the border to strip next. They are playing a game of musical chairs with an army that is constantly shrinking. Moving a brigade from the far northern reaches of the Leningrad military district to the front lines in Ukraine is not a matter of hours. It is a grueling logistical operation that takes days or weeks. Every mile of track is a potential target, every rail bridge is a vulnerability, and every troop train is a high-value asset that requires protection. Ukraine has recognized this logistical fragility and is systematically attacking the rear. They are not trying to invade the Russian heartland in the traditional sense. Instead, they are pushing into these empty zones to force a response, stretching the Russian line until it snaps. By forcing Moscow to constantly react to threats that are hundreds of miles apart, Ukraine is draining the last of the Russian reaction capacity. The weather also plays a critical role, as the transition from the spring thaw to the summer heat turns the unpaved supply routes into ribbons of mud that can swallow trucks and light vehicles alike. The volunteer militias are not prepared for this, and they certainly cannot manage the complex logistics of modern high-intensity warfare. They are holding a line that has no depth, no backup, and crucially, no heavy support. All of these tactical calculations, all of the maneuvering, and all of the strategic posturing are utterly meaningless, however, without the machines of war themselves. Because a piece of metal, no matter how sophisticated, is nothing more than a paperweight without the supply chain and the trained human operators to bring it to life. This is the brutal lesson of the last 4 weeks. We have spent decades analyzing the on-paper specs of Russian hardware, the projected range, the payload capacity, the radar cross-sections, as if these numbers held some immutable truth about the balance of power. But in the mud and the blood of the Ukrainian front, those glossy brochures from the Moscow air shows have been shredded. Take the S-400 Triumph, for example. On paper, this is the crown jewel of Russian air defense. It boasts a maximum engagement range of 250 miles and is designed to track hundreds of targets simultaneously. It was supposed to be the impenetrable umbrella that shielded the Leningrad military district. Yet, the reality on the ground is a disaster. We have seen these systems stripped from their permanent positions in Kaliningrad and the Finnish border and rushed to the front, only to be dismantled by a swarm of low-cost, mass-produced Ukrainian drones. When you have a saturation attack involving hundreds of incoming drones, even an S-400 system becomes strategically inefficient. Each interceptor missile costs millions of dollars, while the incoming threat costs pennies on the dollar to produce. The system is designed for high-altitude bombers, not for hunting down small, buzzing, inaudible drones that swarm in from every direction until the radar array is overwhelmed or physically destroyed by precision-guided strikes. The same tragic irony applies to Russia's flagship tank, the T-90M Proryev. Moscow claims this is the most advanced vehicle in its class, a fully modernized combat system optimized for 21st century warfare. Weighing in at roughly 50 tons, it features a 125mm smoothbore gun and layers of relict explosive reactive armor that are supposed to make it virtually immune to anti-tank missiles. But the field reality is a different story entirely. We have confirmed the loss of over 150 of these tanks, and the videos are horrifyingly consistent. They suffer from an ancient design flaw, the so-called jack-in-the-box syndrome. Because the ammunition is stored in a carousel at the base of the turret, any successful hit that penetrates the thin upper armor leads to a catastrophic detonation. The turret is blown clean off the chassis, killing the crew instantly. These tanks were meant to be the vanguard of a new Russian military, but now they are treated as endangered species, often held back in reserve because their presence on the front line is a liability rather than an asset. They require specialized crews, complex maintenance that cannot be performed in a muddy field, and constant infantry support that is increasingly unavailable as Russia feeds its regular army into the meat grinder. Meanwhile, the asymmetry of this war has been defined by the Zala Lancet loitering munition. This is a system that stands in stark contrast to the massive, expensive, and fragile S-400S and T-90 The Lancet has a relatively modest range of 25 miles, but it is lethal because of its versatility and its price tag. It carries a payload of roughly 6 to 10 pounds, which is more than enough to disable a radar dish, destroy an MLRS launcher, or ignite a fuel tanker. Because it is small, mobile, and can be launched by a single operator in less than a minute, it has effectively bypassed Russia's expensive, traditional defenses. Russia is trying to play a high-tech game with limited, degraded pieces, while Ukraine is playing a modern, networked, and asymmetric game that requires fewer resources to achieve a disproportionately higher impact. It is a fundamental collapse of the technological theory that underpinned the Russian military for 20 years. The hardware is not the problem. The doctrine is, you cannot replace a professional, highly trained division with a skeleton crew of conscripts and expect the equipment to function at its peak, especially when that equipment is being cannibalized for spare parts to keep the rest of the fleet running. It is a slow, grinding process of cannibalization that is eating away at the very heart of the state. These machines were built for a parade in Red Square, not for a war that has turned the entire country into an industrial slaughterhouse. But even as the tanks rust and the air defenses burn, we have to look past the smoke and the fire to the bank accounts and the factories. Because modern wars are not just won with steel, they are won with the money that keeps the assembly lines moving and the economy from collapsing under the weight of its own ambition. The battlefield is only one half of this equation, because modern conflicts are ultimately won in the ledger books and the back rooms of global finance. While we focus on the shredded metal and the abandoned garrisons, the silent war is being fought in the oil ports of the Baltic and the currency markets of Moscow. By stripping the Leningrad region of its defenses, Putin has done more than just weaken his border. He has left the golden goose of his economy exposed. The ports of Primorsk and Luga, which handle millions of barrels of crude oil every single day, have become the primary targets of this new, non-kinetic front. When these facilities are struck, it is not just a building that catches fire, it is the entire war budget that burns. Every disruption in output translates into lower tax revenue, which means the Kremlin struggles to pay the 1 million ruble bonuses required to lure recruits into the meat grinder. This is a vicious, self-defeating loop, where the hunger for soldiers on the front line directly starves the industrial base of the capital required to keep those soldiers armed, fed, and fighting. This economic attrition is compounded by a total failure of the domestic social contract. For years, the Kremlin's legitimacy rested on a promise of stability and security. Now, that promise has been shattered by the reality of the war coming home. When the governor of a major region declares his own territory a frontline zone, the psychological barrier between the civilian population and the war evaporates. Families in the border regions are no longer insulated observers. They are witnesses to the decay, watching as their sons are conscripted and their garrisons are emptied. The desperation is visible in the way the regime is now forced to rely on civilian volunteer squads to do the job of trained military units. It is an admission of failure so profound that it undermines the very narrative of strength Putin has spent decades cultivating. The ultimate paradox of this entire campaign is that the man who claimed he was acting to prevent the collapse of his nation has become the primary architect of its destruction. Every move he made to secure his borders has resulted in more territory being lost or threatened. Every step taken to bolster the Russian military has resulted in a deeper, more agonizing degradation of its professional capability. He sought to project power, but he has only succeeded in exposing weakness. He wanted to divide NATO, but he has instead created a more unified, more capable, and larger alliance than at any point in the last 30 years. The blanket of Russian defense has been pulled so thin that it has finally torn, and no amount of propaganda can mend the seams. So, here is the question for all of you watching. Given the scale of the depletion we have uncovered today, can this regime survive the next 18 months without resorting to a full national mobilization that would likely shatter the domestic peace? Let us know what you think in the comments section below, and I make it a point to read every single one of your insights. If this deep dive into the real state of the Russian military was eye-opening for you, make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on the bell icon so you never miss a briefing. We will see you in the next one.